That's the Volodymir's Ukrainian pronunciation. The Russian call him Vladimir. So Vladimir of Kyiv and the subjects were baptized. Significantly, they took the form of Christianity from Byzantium, so from Constantinople, not from Rome, and became part of the Orthodox Christian world. 1025 years later, in 2013, a prominent visitor from Moscow addressed a conference in Kyiv celebrating this Christianization of the Rus. Now, quote, a very long quote. This, the visitor refers here to the baptism of 988, was not just Ukraine's civilizational choice. Here, at this site, at the baptismal site on the Dnieper River, a choice was made for the whole of Holy Rus, for all of us. When I say for our entire people, know this reality, of course. Know that there are the Ukrainian people and the Belarusian people and other peoples too. And we respect all the parts of this heritage. But at the same time, at the foundations of this heritage are the common spiritual values that make us a single people. In medieval times, Ukraine was part of first one and then another European power center, coming under the rule of one country, then another. But the vision of uniting both the western and eastern parts of Rus, the state that had its beginning here in Kyiv, always lived on in the east, so he means here Russia, and in the west, he means Ukraine. Wherever our people live, the unity of East and West changed the lives of Ukraine's population and its elite for the better, as everyone knows. Let me say again that we will respect whatever choice our Ukrainian partners, friends, and brothers make. The question is only one of how we go about agreeing on working together under absolutely equal, transparent, and clear conditions. End of quote. The speaker was Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia. 1 year later, Russia annexed the Crimea and started providing military support to the pro-Russian rebels in the two southeastern provinces of Ukraine. Let us take now a closer look at some of Putin's claims. One of it is Ukraine and Russia have the same cultural roots. That is partly correct. Both Russia and Ukraine can trace their origins back to the Principality of Kyiv and its Christian Orthodox culture. But there were also other cultural influences at play, which contributed to making Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Russians distinct nations. Another claim of Putin: for centuries, Ukraine was under foreign rule, but common spiritual values make us a single people. End of quote. This claim is more difficult and only tells one part of the story. With the arrival of the Mongols in the mid-13th century, the land of the Kievan Rus was broken up. At this time, the Rus was no longer a political unit, but split into many independent principalities ruled by descendants of the Kiev dynasty, which often fought each other for preeminence. In the 14th century, the Western and Southwestern Rus principalities, which constitute most of the territory of today's Ukraine and Belarus, were split between the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and the Kingdom of Poland. Meanwhile, the northern and northeastern principalities, including Muscovy, that's the old name for Moscow, remained a part of the Mongol Empire. And these regions in the northeast were cut off from developments in Europe for about 200 years. From the middle of the 13th to the middle of the 17th century, almost all the territory of today's Ukrainian state was not part of Muscovy. It was either part of the Crimean Khanate, the successor state of the Mongol Empire, or part of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and the Kingdom of Poland. Poland and Lithuania were joined in 1389 in a personal union, so the King of Poland was at the same time Grand Duke of Lithuania, or the other way around, the Grand Duke of Lithuania became King of Poland. And in 1569, both parts, Poland and Lithuania, formed a political union. Now they had also a common parliament. The Orthodox Ukrainian lands under Polish-Lithuanian control participated in all the cultural and political developments of this crucial period of European history, while Muscovy did not. Ukraine experienced the Renaissance, and the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation also swept through Ukraine. Many of its cities, including Kyiv, had local forms of self-administration based on German, in the case of Kyiv, Magdeburg law, something unheard of in southern Muscovy. In this period, the East Slavs, descendants of the inhabitants of the Kievan Rus, developed into three distinct groups with different political cultures, traditions, and customs. The Tsardom of Muscovy had an autocratic ruler, combining Mongol and Byzantine forms of rule, while Poland-Lithuania developed into a state dominated by the numerous nobility, about 10% of the population, the nobles, who enjoyed equal political rights. The respective spoken and written languages also started to develop in different directions. In the mid-17th century, Moscow diplomats needed a translator to understand the Ukrainian spoken by the Zaporizhian Cossack. During the decline of the Mongol Empire, the rulers of Muscovy set themselves the task of reconquering the land of the old Kievan Rus. They justified interventions in the domestic affairs of Poland and Lithuania and the annexation of its territory by the pretext that they were protecting Orthodox believers and, in last consequence, were just taking what belonged to them because they considered themselves to be the only legitimate successors of the Grand Princes of Kiev. Since the mid-16th century, the rulers of Moscow started to use the term Russian instead of Muscovian to emphasize their claim to the land of the Rus. This was the point when it became significant that Poland in 966 and Lithuania in 1387 had adopted their Christianity from Rome, not from Byzantium. Almost all of the East Slavic population of Poland and Lithuania were Orthodox, like the time Moscow, while the King of Poland, the nobility, and the Grand Duke of Lithuania belonged to the Latin, the Catholic Church. In 1721, Tsar Peter I, known as the Great, proclaimed himself emperor and started to call his tsardom the Russian Empire. In the mid-17th century, Poland-Lithuania experienced a deep political and military crisis. And over the next 120 years, the Tsar and his allies managed to destroy the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and annex about 80% of the territory of today's Ukraine, inhabited, in the view of the Russians, Orthodox brothers and sisters. You can see here the progress and the process of making Ukrainian lands part of Muscovy and the Russian Empire. About 20% of the territory in the west and southwest of Ukraine, around Rus, Lwów, and Chernihiv, never became part of the Russian Empire, but belonged to Hungary, Poland, Lwów, or the Ottoman Empire, before becoming part of the Habsburg Empire from the 1770s. Also, 20% of today's Ukrainian territory was always outside of the Russian Empire. In the Russian census of 1897, only 44% of the population were registered based on their native language as Great Russians. So that's what we understand under Russians. The 18% Ukrainians or Ukrainian speakers were referred to as Little Russians, Their language was called Little Russian dialect and was seen by the Russian authorities as a corrupted form of Russian. But the 19th century saw the emergence of modern Ukrainian literature, art, music, and political thought. So we see a Ukrainian national movement developing in the Russian Empire. The Russian imperial authorities desperately tried to stop Ukrainian nation building by closing down Ukrainian cultural organizations and suppressing publications in Ukrainian. Russian historians claim the heritage of the Kievan Rus exclusively for Russia, leaving no space for a different Ukrainian art. Ukrainians were considered to be a branch of the Russian people who had been estranged by temporarily coming under Lithuanian, Polish, Hungarian, Romanian, Turkish, or Austrian rule. The view of the Tsardom of Muscovy and then the Russian Empire as the legitimate and only heir of the Kievan Rus was cemented by the work of thousands of historians in and outside of Russia. It dominated academia and shaped the perception of Ukraine and its history in the wider public as part of the Russian world. These claims that the Principality of Kyiv is solely part of Russian history were challenged by the modern Ukrainian national movement, which began in the Russian part of Ukraine in the first half of the 19th century. As a result of the anti-Ukrainian measures in the Russian Empire, in the 1860s, the center of Ukrainian politics moved to Eastern Galicia, the region around Lwów, which belonged to Austria-Hungary. So it became important that not all of Ukraine was controlled by Russia, because now the Ukrainian national movement, which was not capable of organizing themselves in the Russian Empire, could organize themselves in a much more liberal Austrian-Hungarian, in Austria-Hungary. The dominant Ukrainian national narrative of the time did not view Russians and the Russian Empire, but Ukrainians as the true heirs of the Kievan Rus. You see here one of the slide, I think it was a result of a tweet of the US Embassy in Kyiv. It's a bit unfair because Moscow is not the first place where the princes in the northeast organized themselves. So Vladimir Susta, so Vladimir was actually the center of the northwest before Moscow became the center. So there's a strong emphasis in Ukrainian historiography on the continuity of the people living on the territory of the Kievan Rus. Ukrainians consider themselves to be the descendants of those people and insist that Ukrainian traditions of statehood exist. They consider the kingdom of Galicia-Volhynia in western Ukraine and not Muscovy as the true successor of the Kievan Rus. You see it here on the map. Ukrainians and Belarusians also claim a share of the heritage of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, whose court language was not Lithuanian, the language of the warrior nobles, but the Baltic language, but Chancery Slavonic, a precursor of modern Belarusian and coming from the Kievan Rus. Many noblemen in Lithuania were Orthodox East Slavs, also known as Ruthenians. Ukrainian historians view the Cossack hetmanate of Bogdan Khmelnytsky in the middle of the 17th century as the first attempt to create a genuinely Ukrainian state. The Cossacks play an essential role in the Ukrainian story and are even mentioned in the current national anthem. So we are of Cossack descent. So who were these Cossacks? Cossacks were originally outcasts of society, peasants escaping serfdom in the Ukrainian lands under Polish control, who had run away to the steppe regions of southern Ukraine. There they formed bands living from hunting, fishing, and raids into Tatar territory. The Cossacks also created fortified villages and fortresses, and a society of warriors and farmers soon began to emerge. The first Cossacks in Ukraine were of mixed ethnicity and included Tatars, Poles, Lithuanians, and Ruthenians. In the 16th century, the East Slavic element began to dominate. Everyone arriving in the region under Cossack control was free. The Polish crown to which the Cossack regions belong, used the Cossacks as border guards against the Crimean and Ural Tatars. These are two of the successor states of the Mongol Empire. The Cossacks governed themselves and formed 4 regiments. They controlled what is today southeastern Ukraine. The Cossacks elected their officers, including their military leader, who took the title Hetman. In war, they formed the infantry of the Polish army and contributed substantially to the successes, Polish military successes at the end of the 16th, early 17th century. The Cossacks first tried to find their place within the social order of Poland-Lithuania, which at this time mostly consisted of noblemen and insurged peasants. The Cossacks tried to acquire rights similar to the Polish and Polonized Ruthenian nobility, but failed. Only a few thousand Cossacks were registered as equal to the nobility. In the middle of the 17th century, the Cossacks had finally enough. They tried to separate themselves from the Polish crown, fought against the Polonized Ruthenian nobility in the Ukrainian lands, massacred many Jews, and created state-like structures. When the fortunes of war started to turn, and the Cossacks lost their main ally against Poland, the Crimean Khan, they came under severe military pressure from Poland and asked the Tsar of Muscovy for help. This was a logical decision on their part, on the part of the Cossacks, as one of the reasons for the Cossack rebellion was the discrimination against the Orthodox Church in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The overwhelming majority of Cossacks were Orthodox and connected to their religion with the Orthodox Tsar of Muscovy. From the perspective of the Cossack leaders, and later from the perspective of Ukrainian historians, the alliance with Muscovy in the treaty of very famous treaty in Russian and Ukrainian history, the Treaty of Pereyaslav of 1654, was a temporary alliance. From the perspective of the Tsar and Russian historians, it was the acknowledgement of Moscow's suzerainty, dominance over the Ukrainian lands for all eternity. In Ukrainian national historiography, the decision of the Cossack leaders at the time was a grave mistake, as it subordinated the Cossack lands to the Tsar, and 130 years later, to the abolishment of the last remnants of Cossack autonomy, now part of the Russian Empire. Russian and Soviet historiography, the Treaty of 1654, meant the reunification of Ukraine, the heartland of the medieval Kievan Rus, with Moscow under Russian leadership. This view is shared by Putin. Last year, he published an essay, The Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians. He considered it, quote, a great common misfortune and tragedy that a wall has emerged in recent years between Russia and Ukraine, between the parts of what is essentially the same historical and spiritual place. End of quote. He implied that Russia's enemies were trying to, again, Putin, sow discord among people, the overarching goal being to divide and to pit the parts of a single people, so Russians and Ukrainians, against one another. End of quote. Putin is consistent in his belief that Ukrainians and Russians are a single people. Last year, there was no longer any mention of Ukrainians being allowed to make their own choices. It is said in 2015. A few days before the attack on Ukraine, Putin again emphasized that, quote, Ukraine is not just a neighboring country for us. It is an inalienable part of our own history, culture, and spiritual space. These are our comrades, those dearest to us, not only colleagues, friends, and people who once served together, but also relatives, people bound by blood, by family ties. And for Putin, Ukrainians are a 19th century invention of Russia's enemies at the time, Austria-Hungary and the German Empire. In Putin's view, these two powers encouraged the Ukrainian national movement with the aim of weakening Russia, a strategy which Putin considers is now being continued by the West, meaning by NATO and the European Union. In the past, the Russian-Ukrainian conflict was not an ethnic conflict, a conflict between the people, but rather a conflict in which the interest of the state, whether it is Imperial Russia, the Soviet Union, or today's Russian Federation, takes center stage. The precondition of Ukrainian independence at the end of the First World War was the demise of the Russian Empire. In the First World War, an opportunity arose for the Ukrainian national movement to pursue its dream of Ukrainian statehood. But even after the Russian February Revolution of 1917, many Ukrainian patriots still believed that they would live in one state together with Russians. In March 1917, Ukrainian national organizations formed a council in Kyiv, the Central Rada, chaired by the historian Mikhail Orushevsky, to speak for the Ukrainian provinces of the Russian Empire. In its first decrees, the Rada demanded not full independence, but autonomy for a united Ukraine within a democratic and federal Russia. The Central Rada only declared full independence for Ukraine after the Bolsheviks came to power. Between 1918 and 1920, several attempts were made to form an independent Ukrainian state. You see here the three leaders of the most serious attempts to form Ukraine. Orushevsky, beginning, the chairman of the Central Rada, then Pavlo Skoropadsky, who waited with the Germans, and then after he was forced out after the German defeat in the Western Front, Jura, who then had to ally with Pilsudski, with the Pope, to make Ukraine independent. But the would-be Ukrainian governments found themselves first trapped between the Entente and Germany, and then after the defeat of Germany, caught up in the midst of the Russian Civil War, the subsequent state-building and revolutionary war of Eastern Europe. The counter-revolutionary Russian White armies and the Bolshevik Red Army both tried to prevent Ukraine from becoming independent. The newly independent Poland laid claim to Western Ukraine and defeated Ukrainian state-building attempts there. Support from the Entente was not forthcoming, and the attempts to create an independent Ukrainian state ended 1920 in defeat. The territory of today's Ukraine was subsequently divided between Poland, Romania, Czechoslovakia, and with the lion's share, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic becoming part of the Soviet Union. The attitude of the Bolsheviks towards Ukraine was ambivalent, but at least in contrast to the Russian Empire, the Bolsheviks recognized Ukrainians as a distinct nation. The Soviet Union was founded in 1922 and consisted of several republics. The largest republic was the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic. That's today's Russian Federation is its successor. The Ukrainians also received their own republic, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. But neither of the two states was independent. Instead, they formed part of the Soviet Union, which was held together by the dictatorship of the Communist Party. The Soviet government tried to distance itself from the repressive nationality policy of the Russian Empire and promoted the Ukrainian language and Ukrainian culture. This positive policy towards Ukraine changed in the 1930s. For Stalin's taste, the Ukrainian Bolsheviks running the republic had become too nationalistic, and they were purged. Many Ukrainian artists and intellectuals were arrested, shot, or sent to labor camps. Collectivization and decolonization hit Ukraine particularly hard, resulting in a man-made famine in which several million people, mostly ethnic Ukrainians, perished. That's 1932, 1933. Today, most Ukrainian historians and politicians view the famine, they call it Holodomor, as an attempt to destroy the Ukrainian nation and view it as a genocide. After several other parliaments a few days ago, the German Bundestag recognized the Ukrainian famine as a genocide against the Ukrainian nation. Something which Putin often uses as justification for the Russian attack is the concept that Ukraine is ruled by fascists and that Ukrainian nationalism is intimately linked to National Socialism. That's wrong, but there are reasons why this idea is so popular in Russia. As a result of the German-Soviet Treaty of August 1939, those parts of Ukraine which had never previously been part of the Russian Empire came under Soviet control. The Soviet invasion of Western Ukraine in September 1939 led to mass arrests, deportations, and executions of Poles, Jews, and Ukrainians. The Ukrainian nationalists who were concentrated in this part of Ukraine fought against Sovietization and allied themselves temporarily with Nazi Germany. The most influential Ukrainian organization was the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, or OUN. This organization consisted of impactful nationalists who had embraced fascism in the 1930s and early 1940s. In the summer of 1941, they participated in anti-Semitic pogroms and later, after Nazi Germany had murdered almost all Jews, fought against the Polish presence in Western Ukraine by murdering up to 70,000 Jews. These Ukrainian nationalists continued their fight against the Soviet Union even after Germany had been expelled from Ukraine. The last units only surrendered in the early 1950s. Between 1944 and 1947, the Soviet authorities killed about 100,000 Western Ukrainians, so in the annexed territories, who were resisting Sovietization, and many more, several 100,000, were deported to Siberia. Especially in today's Western Ukrainian society, members of the OUN are remembered first and foremost as anti-Soviet resistance fighters, while in the Soviet Union and in Russia, they are denounced as Nazis and German collaborators. In the Ukrainian protests of 2004 and 2014, troops placing themselves in the tradition of the OUN played a visible role. But while they used OUN symbols, many of them did not know its ideology or much about its crimes. In parliamentary elections since then, no right-wing party in Ukraine has managed to get more than 5% of the vote. It is therefore a lie to accuse Ukraine of being dominated by fascists. Furthermore, the overwhelming majority of Ukrainians fighting in the Second World War, about 7 million, or 95% of all Ukrainian combatants, fought in the ranks of the Soviet army. The descendants of these Ukrainian Red Army soldiers are the ones who today are fighting against Russian aggression. The Soviet victory in the Second World War brought one big gain for modern Ukraine. It brought almost all the lands where the majority of the population was Ukrainian into the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. This is one of the reasons for Putin's claim that Ukraine is essentially a creation of the Soviet Union. But this united Ukraine was part of a repressive state, and the important decisions were made in Moscow. After the war, more Russians moved to Ukraine as workers and administrators, and Russian culture and the Russian language permeated Ukraine. This process of gradual Russification has a long tradition, but accelerated in the 1970s. In Central and Eastern Ukraine, especially in the towns and cities, you often heard more Russian than Ukrainian being spoken. This went so far that in the 1980s, Ukrainian culture and the Ukrainian language in Central and Eastern Ukraine were under severe threat. But this disappearance of the idea that Ukrainians differ from Russians was exactly what Putin was hoping for. The major problem for Putin is that Ukrainians had and have other ideas. The first Ukrainian state-building attempts between 1918 and 1920 failed, but in 1990, the overwhelming majority of the population of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic one of the 15 constituent parts of the Soviet Union, voted for Ukrainian independence. This also included the majority of Ukrainians with Russian as their native language. The support for independence was lowest in Crimea with 54%, but even there, the majority still voted for an independent Ukraine. For Ukraine, the collapse of the Soviet Union was a blessing, but Putin considered it a tragedy. Ukraine struggled after independence. Corruption was widespread, and a few oligarchs got richer and richer, while the country continued to be dependent on Moscow. Revolutions, war, and the disintegration of states lead to a reinvention of public spaces and a new code for public space. Monuments fall or are reinterpreted, new monuments are built, historical sites are redecorated, and their meaning reconfigured. This also happened in Ukraine after independence. The first Soviet monuments fell in the early 1990s. The desovietization of public space happened much more thoroughly in Western Europe. There we can also see new monuments being built and streets renamed, dedicated to Ukrainian national traditions, but also to problematic heroes such as Stepan Bandera and Shushkevich, two leaders of the OUN. The Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014 and Russia's military support for the Russian rebels in eastern Ukraine did not have the effect Putin had expected. He thought that it would destabilize Ukraine, that Ukrainians would be divided and eventually accept being ruled indirectly by Moscow. Contrary to his expectations, however, this aggression has led to a much greater national unity in Ukraine, while simultaneously making it obvious to everyone that the current Russian regime is an enemy of Ukrainian independence. Because of Putin's actions, the identification with Ukraine in all Ukrainian regions has grown stronger. 2014 also intensified the attempts in Ukraine to reduce the influence of the Russian language. To illustrate the cultural Russian influence in Ukraine at the time, a study from 2012 claimed that on Ukrainian radio, only 3.4% of songs were in Ukrainian, 60% were in Russian. More than 60% of newspapers, 83% of journals, and 87% of books published in Ukraine were in Russian. On television, only 28% of programs were in Ukrainian. Many Ukrainians are at least bilingual, and about 30%, including President Zelensky, have Russian as their first language. Putin wanted to exploit the presence of so many Russian speakers. He presented Russia as a protector of their interests and used supposed violations of their interests to justify his interference in the internal affairs of Ukraine. The Ukrainian parliament and government played into his hands by stopping Russian being the second state language in some regions, by allowing Russian language newspapers only to be published if they also had a Ukrainian language edition, and by pushing to replace Russian language schools by Ukrainian language schools. From a Ukrainian perspective, these were defensive measures against colonization, which aimed to reduce Russian cultural influence in Ukraine and push back the influence of a state, Russia, that had just annexed part of Ukrainian territory and was clearly aiming to destabilize the country. There is no question that Putin's first war aim was to remove President Zelensky from power, take Kyiv, and by controlling the city, also control its cultural heritage. He would have used this to cement the Russian claim of Russia being the only and legitimate heir of the Kievan Rus. It does not make much sense for the Russian army to target Orthodox churches and other heritage sites which can be claimed for Russia. They are viewed as elements of a common Orthodox Russian culture. Here, the aim is to control those sites and hand them over to the Russian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, which, by the way, supports the war against Ukraine. In 2019, after many years of trying, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church which in 1990 had cut its links to the Russian Orthodox Church, was recognized by the Ecumenical Orthodox Patriarch in Istanbul as fully independent, autocephalous. The Ukrainian authorities are now trying to make this church the dominant and only Orthodox church in Ukraine, so to distance themselves from the Russian Orthodox Church. A few days ago, the Ukrainian government removed the Lavra, the monastery of Kyiv, from the Orthodox Church with links to Moscow and handed it over to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. The war is also a fight against Ukrainian culture and the Ukrainian language. In schools in the occupied territories, the Russian school curriculum and Russian textbooks have been introduced. In May, the Russian occupiers looted Scythian artifacts from Melitopol. Before they withdrew from Kherson, they emptied the local history museum and the art museum. More than 10,000 artifacts disappeared. The Ukrainian Ministry of Culture reported that Russian forces looted thousands of artifacts from more than 40 museums. In the occupied regions, Russian authorities targeted Ukrainian culture, looted libraries, dismantled monuments, displayed Russian culture, removed artifacts from museums and transported them to Russia. They even exhumed the remains of Prince Potyomkin from Kherson and took them to Russia. Potyomkin stands for the annexation and integration of so-called New Russia, the territories near the Black Sea in the Russian Empire. So far, none of the 7 UNESCO World Heritage Sites in Ukraine has been severely damaged. In Kyiv, these are the 11th century St. Sophia Cathedral and the ensemble of the Kyiv Monastery. In Lwów, its historical town center. By 28th of November 2022, UNESCO had verified damage to 221 cultural sites, 98 religious sites, 17 museums, 78 buildings of historical or artistic interest, 18 monuments, and 10 libraries. Most of them seem to have been damaged or destroyed because the Russian army did not, as it should do under the 1954 Hague Convention, take special care to avoid damage to cultural sites. There is, however, as far as I know, no evidence that they have been specifically targeted by Russian artillery or Russian rockets. Nevertheless, Ukrainian authorities, UNESCO, and scholars of Ukrainian history have warned that the destruction and removal of art in Ukraine is an attempt to destroy Ukrainian heritage and Ukrainian identity. This view is underpinned by numerous threats issued by Russian politicians and public figures to do away with the Ukrainian nation. What the Russian aggressor seems to target specifically are those parts of the Ukrainian heritage which are not compatible with the version of history dominant in Russia. The occupiers try to destroy the heritage which could support the idea of a distinct Ukrainian culture. Ukrainians are trying to protect their monuments, libraries, archives, and museums. Volunteers all over Ukraine. Let's see, I can show the picture. So volunteers all over Ukraine are putting artifacts, libraries, archives into storage. Other less movable items are being protected by sandbags, wooden boxes, or wrapped in plastic. Digitalization projects are underway with international help to save Ukrainian cultural heritage from destruction. Since the Russian attack, the Ukrainian authorities have renewed and intensified their attempts to get rid of the remaining monuments and street names from the Soviet period, but the renaming of streets, toppling of monuments, closure or rededication of museums is now increasingly directed against Russian culture. Russian culture and language are seen as the language and the culture of the enemy, of the aggressor, who wants to destroy the Ukrainian nation. There are currently no performances of Russian music or plays in Ukraine. The relationship to the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union is interpreted as a colonial relationship, with Ukraine being colonized by both. De-Russification is seen as part of decolonization. Maybe some suggestions from the Ukrainian side are going a bit too far. A few days ago, the Ukrainian Minister of Culture called upon the West in The Guardian to not perform music or plays by Russian artists as long as Russia continues to wage war on Ukraine. Currently, a draft law is discussed in the Ukrainian parliament forbidding academic texts to reference books and articles in Russian, published in Russia or by Russian authors. The Ukrainian academic community had denounced this proposal, and I can't see it ever becoming law, but it's discussed. During the war in Ukraine, there's also been a lot of social and political pressure on native Russian speakers to switch to Ukrainian. Many Russian native speakers voluntarily switched to Ukrainian to show their support for Ukraine. The best example is the presidential couple. Zelensky and his wife Olena, his native language is Russian. But for many people with unclear national identifications and of mixed Ukrainian-Russian family background, and there are millions of them, the war has been a blow to their identity. Before the war, it was possible to be simultaneously Russian and Ukrainian. But war does what war always does. It forces people to make decisions which they otherwise would not have to make. Over the last 30 years, more and more Russian native speakers identified ethnically as Ukrainians and brought their civic identity in line with their ethnic identity. This is a natural process in any state. But nobody has done more for Ukrainization than Putin. With his attempts to control Ukraine, his annexation of Crimea, support for pro-Russian rebels, and the denial of the existence of a Ukrainian nation, and finally the attack on Ukraine. A symbol for this distancing in Ukraine from the connection to Russia is what happened to the former Arch of Russian-Ukrainian friendship in Kyiv. The Arch of Freedom of the Ukrainian people in Kyiv was previously known as the People's Friendship Arch, or the monument to the reunification of Ukraine with Russia, referring to the Pereyaslav Treaty of 1654. Its popular name in Ukraine, however, was Yarmo. That's Ukrainian for yoke. It was unveiled in November 1982 to celebrate the 60th anniversary of the foundation of the Soviet Union and the 1500th anniversary of Kyiv. It received its current name following a decision by Kyiv City Council in May 2022. The arch was under threat since 2016, with many people wanting to dismantle it as part of decommunization. In 2014, activists added a crack to it. And on 25th of April 2022, Mayor Klitschko announced that the sculptural part with the Russian worker and with the Russian delegation at the Pereyaslav meeting would be dismantled, like 60 other monuments in Kyiv. You see the process of bringing these sculptures down. And come to the end now. The alienation between Russians and Ukrainians before the attack on Ukraine is not a result of Ukrainian attempts to join the European Union, the NATO. It is a result of Putin's policy of trying to bring Ukraine back under Russian control. There can be no question that Russia and Ukraine would have much closer relations if Russia were a democratic country. Along with many members of the Russian political elite, Putin shares the view that it is not in the Russian interest to allow Ukraine leave its sphere of influence. He would agree with the former advisor to the American president, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who once famously remarked that, quote, without Ukraine, Russia ceases to be an empire. But with Ukraine subordinated, then subordinated, Russia automatically becomes an empire. Putin wants Russia to be an empire. His nostalgic feelings for the Soviet Union have nothing to do with sympathies for socialism. He sees the Soviet Union as a state in which Russia was able to express its power and establish its hegemony over Eastern Europe. This war started as Putin's war. It was not the war of Russian oligarchs or wanted by the Russian military or military-industrial complex. And it is not a war of the Russian people. But Russian society is divided. For some Russians, the current war is a tragedy, and all their instincts tell them that it is fundamentally wrong for Russians to be shooting at Ukrainians. But Russians who protest against the war are arrested, mistreated, lose their jobs, have left the country, or are in the process of leaving. Yet another part of the Russian population seems to have bought into Putin's delusions and believes the propaganda reiterated daily in the Russian media that Russia itself is under threat, and that there is something like a Russian world which cannot exist without Ukraine. Putin has managed to make the people around him, the Russian army and Russian soldiers, his accomplices. The more war crimes Russian soldiers commit, the more the perpetrators are bound to Putin. Originally, Putin intended to eliminate democratically elected Ukrainian government and replace it by a pro-Russian puppet government, while winning over the Ukrainian people. He denounced the Ukrainian leadership as Nazis and argued that the war aimed at denazifying Ukraine. Then Putin came to believe that the Ukrainian people were the enemy. His preference is to reverse Ukrainian nation building and force Ukrainians to accept their fate and become part of the Russian people. The recent Ukrainian successes on the battlefield make this unlikely. Now he is trying to grab and keep as much Ukrainian territory as possible. But even these limited aims are now threatened. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you so much, Christoph, for condensing into 45 minutes this extraordinary complex history of Ukraine.